All right, welcome back. We've made it to Unit 13 with only one more to go. So I typically call this unit the Civil Rights era, but it's more than that. So I just want to be clear, it's not only about civil rights, it's quite a bit of other things as well. So right off the bat, we're going to be talking about the expansion of economic prosperity. So the GI Bill. The GI Bill today is mostly about college paid for when you join the military, but it started off with that. It covered tuition, but it also covered hospitals, mortgages. It was intended to help World War II veterans with things that they needed to get back on their feet after the war. And the original GI Bill ended in the 50s, but then today we have all types of programs that help the military, and they fall under what we would call the GI Bill, but they're not the original one. The interstate system. So if you look at the little map, there are interstates going all across America. And again, it's to improve transportation, travel, etc. Many of you may have known this, but I'm sure some of you did not. The interstates are numbered with odd and even numbers. So for example, 64 west is going east to west because 64, 4 is an even number. 95 south is going north to south, etc., because it's an odd number, the 5. So whenever you're looking at any type of interstate, when you're out there on the road and you see it's like 25, you know that's going to be going north to south or south to north, vice versa. If it's 44, you know that's going east to west or west to east. So that's an easy way of determining which direction a particular highway is going. This was set up under President Eisenhower, the former general from World War II, and it definitely makes things a lot easier for the nation. Finally, we have rise of the middle class. Because of the U.S. government's support for the returning veterans after World War II and during the Cold War struggle, more Americans could benefit from goods and services. So more people have more money. That leads to the rise of the middle class. All right, next we have the expansion of initiatives for non-middle class Americans. Lyndon Johnson wants to create this great society by having a war on poverty. So Medicare, Medicaid, and the Economic Opportunity Act are created. So these are things we still have today in terms of Medicare and Medicaid, and a lot of people don't know the difference. Medicare is a federal health insurance program mostly for the elderly, but also benefits some with disabilities. Medicaid is a federal and state health insurance program for those with very low income. And last, the Economic Opportunity Act authorized the formation of community action agencies as part of the war on poverty. So again, all of this is to assist people with low income. Okay, this is a big one. Brown versus the Board of Education. I'm sure all of you have heard of this, but it's a Supreme Court decision that segregated schools must desegregate. So before this, remember there's segregation in the South because of Jim Crow laws. Now this includes Virginia cases Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward. So there's key people that you need to know. So Barbara Johns is a student in Prince Edward's County, and she's one of the first students that actually files a complaint rather than adults. You have Thurgood Marshall, who's the NAACP Legal Defense Team leader. And then you have Oliver W. Hill, who is the NAACP Legal Defense Team leader in Virginia. Earl Warren is the Supreme Court Justice. So Brown versus the Board of Education basically ends the separate but equal foundation for Jim Crow laws that had been going on since post-Civil War. So what's Virginia's response? So unfortunately, this is kind of sad. There's massive resistance. People are not happy. Some schools are closed. There's the establishment of private academies. And again, that's something that people talk about today. When you talk about private schools, they can actually limit who can enter the school. And there's also what's called white flight from urban school systems to suburbs. So again, a lot of white people at that particular time decided they didn't want to have their kids go to school with African American kids, so they left. That brings us to the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP challenged segregation in the courts. That was one of their main things that they were trying to accomplish, so Brown versus the Board of Education was a huge deal. They have a long history of trying to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. You can see there in the picture, that's the historical marker going over what actually happened there. Then we have Emmett Till's lynching in 1955. Emmett Till's lynching in Mississippi and the acquittal of his killers gained international media attention and inspired demands for civil rights. Very sad for this to have happened to this young man. Next, we have two very important organizations in terms of they're very important to the civil rights movement. We have the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. This is led by Martin Luther King Jr. It supported nonviolent direct action like boycotts, sit-ins, marches, and other demonstrations. Boycotts in particular are extremely important because here in America, money is a lot of everything, to be fair. So Martin Luther King's people boycotted the buses. Remember Rosa Parks? So the boycott there is that African Americans would not use the buses, they would carpool. And ultimately this put pressure because the companies are losing money. So if you're racist and you don't want African Americans to ride your buses, then that means you're going to lose business and therefore they lose money. So that's a way to put pressure by using boycotts. Today we have the same thing. There'll be certain circumstances where a company's political views don't match up and people will say, hey, let's boycott this. And again, it happens very frequently today and it's very effective, again, because money is so important. I would argue that you as a young person listening to this video, your money is so important. It is one of the biggest parts of your voice that you have. So if there's products that you don't agree with, aspects of a company, don't buy those things. That's the way you can basically let your voice be heard more than any other way, is again by money. Last, we have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. This is inspired by the Greensboro sit-in by 4 Black college students, initially formed as a student chapter of the SCLC, but eventually became independent. Next up, we have the 1963 March on Washington, and if you recall from the very beginning of this video, that's what I chose to start off with. I took Flight Simulator and went to the Lincoln Memorial to get a view of the reflecting pool and the Washington Monument, as you can see in many of the images associated with this march. So participants were inspired by Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It helped to influence public opinion to support civil rights legislation, and it demonstrated the power of nonviolent mass protest. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a pretty big deal. Birmingham campaign led by Martin Luther King and the SCLC convinced JFK, the president who was assassinated we talked about last unit, it convinced him to publicly call for new civil rights legislation. It prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. It desegregated public accommodations. For example, hotels, restaurants, and movie theaters. You could no longer have separate hotels for Black people or Asian people or any other race. President Lyndon B. Johnson played an important role in the passage of the act after JFK's assassination. So if you were unaware, Lyndon Johnson was JFK's vice president. So when JFK was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson becomes president. So the voting rights of 1965 comes up here. The March from Selma. I'm sure everyone's heard of the Selma incident, the protesting, and the brutality by the police. So John Lewis led the first day of the march. Peaceful protesters were attacked by the Alabama State Police, in which became known as Bloody Sunday. There are songs written about that if you know of the band U2. This also outlawed literacy tests. So below this, I have an image taken from a literacy test in Louisiana. And if you read through those, what you'll notice is several of the questions are basically impossible to answer. And you have to remember, the people who are scoring, whether you answered this correctly or not, they have basically a blank slate to say, no, you did not answer this correctly. And therefore, you would be denied the right to vote. So for example, it says, draw a line under the last word in this line. That's pretty straightforward. But if you look above that, it says, draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. What does that even mean? How do you draw a line around something? So if I was a racist person and I didn't want you or someone else to vote, I could literally say, hey, you drew a circle, so you're wrong, because one wrong answer denies you. So federal registrars were sent to the South to register voters. This resulted in an increase of African American voters. And President Lyndon Johnson also played a pretty big role in this. Remember, JFK was really big on civil rights, but again, he was assassinated. So Lyndon Johnson, instead of doing something different, he took up these policies and he became a big part of signing all of them. The Americans with Disabilities Act addressed the discrimination of people with disabilities. So this is also called the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Section 504 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in federal programs and recipients of federal financial assistance. Very important. Then we have the Individuals with Disabilities Act, also called IDEA. This requires that all children with disabilities receive a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So instead of having students with disabilities separated and put off by themselves, they're included in the general population. So the least restrictive environment means they're trying to be put in with any other student unless it's just not possible. If there's just extreme disabilities that require certain things. So for the most part in public schools today, the population includes students with disabilities mixed in that many people would never know. All right, next up, the Immigration Act of 1965. So why do people come to America? For political freedom and economic opportunity. We have one of the best economies on the planet, and a lot of people want to come here for more money. So issues related to immigration policy. There's a strain on government services. So for example, welfare and other programs, when there's more immigration, sometimes they don't have the skills for certain jobs and they struggle. So that might put them qualifying for certain programs. It fills low-paying jobs. A lot of Americans don't want to work certain jobs, and immigrants fill those. There's border issues. Again, we have that today. Throughout history, this is not just a modern thing. Throughout history, we've had issues with immigration. And when I say issues, I don't mean negative or positive. I'm saying certain people think different ways, whether it's negative or positive. There's a pathway to citizenship, bilingual education, and increasing cultural diversity. And last, what are the contributions of immigrants? Well, there's diversity in music, visual arts, and literature, roles in the labor force, again, jobs that people don't want to do, achievements in science, engineering, and in other fields, and many minorities elected to high public offices, for example, at national and state levels, are former immigrants. All right, so now we're going to go in a different direction. We're going to be talking a little bit about the U.S. presidents since 1980. So we have Ronald Reagan, who was president from 80 to 88. He was a conservative Republican, and he advocated for tax cuts, transfer of responsibilities to state governments. So he wants to reduce the federal government. He wants to appoint judges and justices who exercise judicial restraint. There's a reduction in the number and scope of government programs and regulations, and strengthening the American military. And I want to make a quick point. For all of these presidents we're going to be mentioning here, these key points are not necessarily positive or negative, and they can be construed in different ways. For example, I can make a positive case for each of these bullets, and I could also make a negative case for each of these bullets. So that's something that I definitely would talk to a teacher, to ask their opinions, talk to your parents, ask their opinions of these things when you're making your political decisions based on current events and things like that. But that's a big thing to understand about history. You really need to understand both sides of all the arguments, and that way you can be more informed and well-rounded. All right, next up, George H.W. Bush, who was Ronald Reagan's vice president. He was president from 89 to 93. While he was president, we saw the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the breakup of the Soviet state, the reunification of Germany. So no longer is Germany East and West Germany, it just becomes Germany again. We also have the Persian Gulf War of 1990 and 91. This is called Operation Desert Storm. This is the first war in which American women served in combat roles. And also the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and the Clean Air Act of 1990. All right, after President George H.W. Bush, we have William J. Clinton from 1993 to 2001. He's generally called Bill Clinton. So we have the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, restored full diplomatic relations with Vietnam, which means because of the Vietnam War, we did not trade with them, but now we are. We recognize them as a nation, etc. Lifting of economic sanctions against South Africa once apartheid ended. Apartheid was basically legal segregation and racism. And once that ended, we recognized them as a country again and traded with them, and dramatically reshaped welfare programs and helped reduce federal welfare spending. So again, welfare under Bill Clinton became the idea that, for example, the government is there to help you, but not permanently. So the job focus switches from just giving out money to literally giving out money while you need help, but also helping you to get a job. Next up, we have George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush. He was president from 2002 to 2009. So while he was president, the 9/11 terrorist attacks happened in New York and the Pentagon in Pennsylvania, etc. There are wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and also the law No Child Left Behind was passed while George W. Bush was president. Next, we have the first African-American president in the history of the United States, Barack Obama, from 2009 to 2016. So while he was president, Osama bin Laden, who was behind the September 11th attacks, he was hunted down, and there's the campaign against Al-Qaeda. There's the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq. He oversaw and called for Congress to pass legislation to reform health care in the U.S. There's patient protection and the Affordable Care Act of 2010 that provided medical care for millions of Americans. So space exploration and technology. In the early 1960s, President Kennedy pledged increased support for the American space program. The race to the moon became extremely important. Astronaut John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth, and in 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong was the first person to step onto the moon's surface. His famous quote is, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Sally Ride was the first female American astronaut. Over the past 3 decades, improved technology and media have brought about better access to communication and information for business and individuals in both urban and rural areas. As a result, many more Americans have had access to global information and viewpoints. So what does that mean in plain English? It means that technology has really helped to allow the expression of more viewpoints. For example, we have social media today, and the expression of different viewpoints can be both a positive and a negative, because again, especially on social media, you see so much false information and people take that as truth. But early on, the spread of information and dissemination of such, it's like media. For example, you have CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, you have different channels. People can get different opinions from the people, reporting. And that's maybe a positive or negative as well, because again, the news used to just more or less report the facts of what happened, and over time that has become more opinionated. There's more shows where the hosts are giving their opinion, and that influences people both positively and negatively depending on the situation. All right, next up we have examples of technological advances. So first off, space exploration. We have the Space Shuttle, the Mars rover, the Voyager missions, and the Hubble telescope. All of those are represented in pictures. Again, the Space Shuttle, the big deal there is it's reusable. When we were using rockets, once they launched, they were basically you're not able to use them again. The Space Shuttle can land like an airplane. The Mars rover, we've had several. They're up there taking live pictures and sending back to Earth, which is pretty cool. Next, we have communications. Obviously, you guys know what televisions are. Personal computers, cellular telephones. I'm sure you've heard of those, right? Then we have electronic mail or email and social media. Now, I was kind of being funny there. If you look at that first cell phone, that's the ones that were the most common in the mid-90s, and they were horrible. They were expensive. Then you have the little icon, the yellow man. That's for America Online. It's not the first internet service, but for many people, it was the first internet service. And then you have MySpace, which was an early version of social media. Kind of weird, but yeah, I remember having a MySpace account. And clearly for robotics, R2-D2 and C-3PO are by far the first robots ever existed. Because remember, in Star Wars, it says it happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So that's ancient history. But in seriousness, the robotics we're talking about are generally for like assembly line usage. So even today, we have robots. They're not in human form, but they are just machinery that can do basic tasks repetitively, more accurately than humans can. And last, we have medical care. So in particular, the polio vaccine by Dr. Jonas Salk and cancer screenings are becoming much, much more popular, much more common, however you want to say it. and it saves a lot of lives. Okay, and we've finally reached the last piece of information. We have cultural changes to society in the second half of the 20th century. So we have television. Second time we've mentioned television. Boy, television is so important, isn't it? So anyway, the main mode of media for news, entertainment, and cultural trends after World War II. And again, that is the case. Today, we have less people using broadcast television. We're more or less streaming what we want when we want. But again, it started off where people's lives, especially in the evenings, were based around sitting around the TV and watching the news. Then we have new genres of music. We have rock and roll, disco, hip hop, and other new genres that have popped out since then. We have the expansion of pop culture. So popular culture, or again, pop culture is what we call it, is a lot of things that are popular at the time. I mean, that's obvious, but some people just are not aware. I've asked students, what is pop culture? And they struggle to answer that question. So pop culture leads to conflict between opposing cultural views. We see this a lot today. Again, social media plays a big role in that. And so many people on the internet do not understand that opinions, are just that. They're opinions, and everybody has different opinions on certain things. And then there's also the line between fact and fiction, etc. We have more opportunities for women. There's an increasingly large percentage of Americans in the labor force who are women. Women in non-traditional jobs. For example, we saw that beginning with World War II with welding. That was something women generally didn't do, but now you see women on submarines in the military, piloting airplanes, etc. The role of the courts in providing opportunities for women, that becomes a big deal. We have the need for more affordable daycare as more women enter the workforce. Also, there's the problem of equitable pay. Why, even today, do some women not make as much money as men in the same jobs? It's very hard to understand, but I'll try to explain that in a second. But last, we have the glass ceiling. This is a perception that women can only make a certain percentage of what some men will make. So, for example, if you had a CEO of a corporation and the man is making $500 million, that a female CEO may only make $400 million. So back to what I was going to say about women and the need for daycare. Because women are the ones who get pregnant and they bear children, there is a discrimination against them because, for example, if you owned a business and you have a man and a woman both applying for the same job, you may or may not think in the back of your mind, well, if I hire this woman and she has a baby, she's going to be out for a certain amount of time, and then she's going to have issues where she may have to call in sick because her child, this, that, and the other. So that's kind of not really fair because to be honest, that's the male's job as well to take care of the child if they're sick. But because of traditional values, of the male and female genders, that wasn't always the case. And now we have more single parents and things like that. So there's laws to protect from those types of things. And many businesses do provide daycare, et cetera, to try to help women out. And again, it's unfortunate that it's that way, but I'm just trying to explain this so you can understand what's the big deal, because I know most of us today would think, man, woman, it doesn't really matter. It's who can do the job more effectively. But again, it comes down to when you're a business owner, you think of those types of things. Many of you have probably heard the idea that they want maternity leave for men and women. And one of the reasons for that is because they feel like if both are equal to this, receive the same maternity leave, you can't discriminate against the women because the men can also get it. So someone who's hiring for a position, it doesn't matter if they hire a man or a woman. So that's just some information that maybe helps you understand why those certain arguments are out there. All right, well, that brings us to the end of this video. We have one more to go. So I will see you in the next video for Unit 14, which is the late 20th century and the early 21st century.